We're going to talk about the support library and AndroidX. We're first going to look at what the support library is and motivate its need. Then we'll talk about some of the benefits that are derived from using the support library. And finally, we'll talk about the current state of the support library, a system called AndroidX. To fully appreciate the need for the support library, we have to first understand one of the most entrenched problems in the Android ecosystem, that of fragmentation. To put it simply, fragmentation occurs when there are multiple versions of Android that are running on multiple devices at the same time. It makes it difficult for developers to build applications that fully and properly support all of these versions at the same time. Fragmentation can occur vertically or horizontally. Vertical fragmentation is when we have different numeric versions of Android out in the wild at the same time. Horizontal fragmentation is when we have the same numeric version, but where changes have been introduced by manufacturers or carriers. Essentially, Android, being an open system, allows device manufacturers to make changes to the operating system so that it runs properly on their hardware. So they have to verify that the system works with their processors, their memory, their antennas, and they have to make sure that their drivers are fully incorporated into the operating system. Additionally, they may want to provide applications that provide core features of the operating system, for example, texting, contact list management, etc. Before these devices get into the hands of consumers, they may also pass through carriers. Oftentimes, these carriers also want to make changes to the operating system. For example, they may decide to limit a particular feature of the operating system, such as the hotspot feature of Android. They may choose to do this because they are incentivized to offer this as a paid feature to their customers. Ultimately, all of these changes results in a version of Android that has germane differences from one device to another or one carrier to another. Bringing this all together, for any single version of Android, you have an explosive number of devices that all behave just a little differently, adding to the complexity for developers. What's more is because of the amount of effort it takes to bring any single version of Android to the consumer, when it has to pass first through the manufacturer and then through the carrier, we oftentimes end up with devices that are not provided with upgrades once they are released. That means from the time you purchase the device to the time your device dies and goes to the landfill, you may only have a handful of updates, and oftentimes you will not receive a major update. Therefore, because no single device is necessarily being kept up to date with the latest version of Android, we get over time vertical fragmentation. When this occurs, developers are oftentimes forced to essentially build applications that target the lowest common denominator, meaning they will not incorporate the newest features available on the latest version of Android simply because all users of the operating system may not have access to those features. Of course, it is possible to build an application in such a way that the newer features are presented to users on new versions of the operating system, where those features are hidden from older versions. But this does add to the complexity, and oftentimes developers simply go the easier route and simply build a reduced set of features. Recognizing this problem, Google released something called the support library. That is, instead of pushing all features that make up the operating system as a part of the SDK, Android extracted many of these features and provided them as separate libraries that developers could simply incorporate into their applications. By doing this, users were able to get the latest features simply by installing the application rather than having to ensure that they're running the latest version of the operating system. Support library features included backwards compatibility for older versions of Android, convenience and helper classes to aid developers in building applications properly, as well as debugging, testing, and other utilities to aid development. The support libraries were separated and named by versions, where the name of a particular library was an indicator of the lowest API number of the operating system that library would support. Over time, this convention changed, however, as the minimum SDK for a given library might increase higher than the number used for the library's name. You can imagine this could cause a little bit of confusion. Here we see some example libraries as well as some of the features that were introduced. So for example, we see that the action bar UI pattern was introduced in the version 7 support library. This meant that you could have action bars in any application that was running on Android as low as version 7. This is despite the fact that the action bar pattern was actually introduced in Android version 11. Over time, the support libraries transitioned into what is now referred to as AndroidX. In fact, the original support libraries are deprecated and no longer supported in their original packages. Android X has now subsumed all of the support library packages, moving them under the Android X namespace. Additionally, each of the packages are now individually maintained, allowing us to add whichever feature we would like to our application without having to bring in additional features that we may not have actually wanted to utilize, allowing us to keep the size of our projects relatively small. Android X also includes Android Jetpack. Android Jetpack is a set of libraries that allow us to implement best practices, reduces the amount of boilerplate code that needs to be written, and simplifies complex tasks that are common across many different Android applications. Here we see some examples of Jetpack libraries. Under the Foundation category, we have AppCompat and Test. Under Architecture, you'll find libraries such as Lifecycle and LiveData. Permissions and notifications fall under the Behavior category. And under UI, we have things such as fragments and layouts. Now, it might seem useful to dive into a demo here of Android X and the support library, but it turns out that's actually redundant because we've been using Android X and the support library since the beginning. It's why so many things are so awkwardly named and weirdly categorized. For example, here in our default layout, we see a constraint layout being used as the root element. If we take a look at code, we see that the constraint layout has this prefix AndroidX. So we see the full namespace being used with the AndroidX prefix. And if we compare that to any other layout, for example, a frame layout, where there is no prefix, there is no fully qualified name, of course, because the frame layout is a core part of the SDK, we see that the constraint layout is essentially an add-on. Similarly, when we're working with activities, we know that our activity must extend the activity class. However, we see here that we're not inheriting from just a base activity class, but rather from a class called AppCompatActivity. That is the version of the activity class that comes from the support library. In fact, we can see that the import is from AndroidX.AppCompat. When we wanted to get access to the action bar, we used support action bar. Of course, there is an action bar reference, but this is the SDK's version, not the support library. Similarly, when we wanted to access the fragment manager, we used support fragment manager. If we attempted to use just directly fragment manager, the IDE tells us, hey, this is deprecated because we're being directed to the support library version because that has backwards compatibility built in. Now, all of these features are available to us out of the box simply because when we create a new project, a set of dependencies are automatically added that reference these AndroidX packages. So we see here core, AppCompat, we see constraint layout, again, as a separate package, as well as things for doing application testing. So as you start to utilize more features of the operating system, you may be directed to utilize the AndroidX or the support library version of those features. And certainly as you start to add new components to your application, they will almost certainly be Android Jetpack components. So this is essentially AndroidX and the support library, Android's approach to addressing fragmentation in the operating system.